Hey guys, so earlier this year I started the Harvest Moon Retrospective series in which, I plan to retrospectively review every game in the Harvest Moon series. I've only done the Super Nintendo game so far. It's been a few months since I've really done anything with it, and let me just check my excuse book here. I haven't really been working. School hasn't really been that bad. Oh! There it is. I'm a lazy sack of shit. So while I might not have done a lot of work over the past few months on this project, I have done a lot of thinking about it. Originally, I was going to do all of the games chronologically. For the most part, I will be sticking to that, but some of the games are just easier and better reviewed together. The Harvest Moon titles on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color are just so similar that it would be kind of silly for me to review them individually. With that having been said, in this video we're going to look at Harvest Moon GB, Harvest Moon GBC, Harvest Moon GBC2, and Harvest Moon GBC3. Even though I'm technically covering 4 games here, this video is probably going to go by relatively quickly because there's not a lot to talk about with these titles. First off, the only thing I'm going to mention about Harvest Moon GB is that it exists. As you can probably guess just by the title, it's Harvest Moon for Game Boy. The only difference between Harvest Moon GB and GBC is that GB is in black and white. With Harvest Moon GBC, you could insert the cartridge in an original Game Boy and play in black and white if you needed to, but putting it into Game Boy Color, well, it added color. Harvest Moon GB and GBC are all about the farming. Leaving the farm will simply take you to a menu. You can use this menu to access the shops, but there is no physical town for you to explore or anyone for you to really interact with. This game is also really short, lasting only one in-game year. Harvest Moon GBC is a much more refined experience than its Super Nintendo predecessor. That might sound like a compliment, but it's really not. GBC isn't bad, there's just not a lot of content. As long as you don't mind that you can't marry 2D waifus, it's not that bad. But let's face it, the majority of people that play Harvest Moon play it to marry 2D waifus. Joking aside, the farming process is still exactly the same as it was on the Super Nintendo. In a lot of the newer titles, this is really engaging, but in the Super Nintendo title and this one, it's just such a small part of the experience that it being broken down to the only feature is kinda shallow. It reminds me of what happened with Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer. Nintendo took this one feature of the game and made the entire game based around it. The difference is that in Happy Home Designer, they improved upon the feature they chose to focus on. In Harvest Moon GBC, it's exactly the same. Before we move on to GBC2, it's worth mentioning that this was the first game to include the harvest sprites. It was also the first Harvest Moon game where you could be a boy or a girl, even though this feature wouldn't be seen in the home console releases for quite some time. So even though in the beginning of this video I referred to it as Harvest Moon GBC2, it's actually titled Harvest Moon 2 GBC. The reason this is so confusing to me is that the game is actually the 4th in the series, released after Harvest Moon 64. To be honest, I barely have anything to say about this game. The graphics are a very slight improvement over the first GBC title, but there's not so much you can do with the technology. There's still no marriage system, but there is a town for you to actually explore this time. Ultimately though, the town is really just a menu you can walk around in. While I think GBC2 is an improvement over the first GBC title and more entertaining, it's still a huge step back coming after Harvest Moon 64 and reverts to the original game's mechanics. Moving on to Harvest Moon GBC3, or Harvest Moon 3 GBC rather, it's actually the best Harvest Moon title on the Game Boy Color, which is kind of like being the best of the worst. Also, I dare you to take a look at this credit sequence and tell me they're not trying to rip off Pokemon Gold and Silver. So what exactly makes Harvest Moon 3 GBC the best of the Game Boy Color titles? Well, for starters, the town is an actual town this time, with residents and isn't just a menu. There's actually a lot of really interesting events in this title. You can also actually customize your character in this version, although it's only color palette swaps. Lastly, you can finally actually get married for the first time in a Game Boy Color title. Unfortunately, you can't actually choose from multiple girls to marry. You will always end up marrying the opposite gender player character from which you picked in the beginning. So all in all, if somebody put a gun to my head and told me I had to play one of the Game Boy Color titles, I'd definitely pick 3. That being said, I'd much rather just play the Super Nintendo original than any of these games. They haven't aged well, they're not memorable, at least not to me. The only real things of merit they bring to the table is that they were the introduction of being able to pick your gender, which again doesn't show up in the console titles for a very long time. And they did introduce the harvest sprites, which play a major role in the story of some of the future games. So, hey, at least these games have that claim to fame. I mean, there's worse out there in this series. There's a lot worse out there in this series. So now that that's over, I'm going to break my little monologue, charismatic voice that I use in my videos. Um, really am appreciative if you're watching this and actually entertained by this. I'm only doing this really for myself. I am a journalist and a journalism major, but I don't make anything off of this. This is really just for experience and because I really do love these games enough to want to do it. Um, I do put out some content for a couple of other sites if you would like to check those out. The first of which is Nintendo Fuse. I'll leave links to these sites in the description, but Nintendo Fuse, pretty self-explanatory. It's a Nintendo news site. We have reviews and stuff like that too. The other site that I write for is called The Variant. It's North Carolina based, but it covers um, conventions, anime conventions, comic book conventions, things of that nature. So even if you don't live in that area, if that's something that's of interest to you, cosplay and things like that, definitely go give us a read as well. Also, will be a link to that in the description. And finally, I do have a personal blog that I kind of chronicle uh, my content here actually, but also movie reviews that are only on that blog, links to my content on Nintendo Fuse and the variant. Um, it's kind of like a reference point more than anything, but also we'll have a link to that in the description if you'd like to check that out. So again, thank you so much for listening to me drone on about farming simulator games. In the next video, we are definitely going to be taking a look at Harvest Moon 64. I have not decided if I want to do Harvest Moon 64 and Back to Nature in the same video or not. But regardless, hopefully you look forward to that. So, thanks guys.